In our studies of Mark's Gospel, or Good News, we come today to one of the most unpleasant incidents in the ministry of Jesus, the murder by beheading of John the Baptist. Let me read to you Mark's record. King Herod heard about what Jesus was doing, for Jesus' name had become well known. Some were saying John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him. Others said he's Elijah. And still others claimed he's a prophet, like one of the prophets of long ago. But when Herod heard this, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested, and he'd had him bound and put in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. For John had been saying to Herod, it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. So Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him, but she was not able to because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. Finally, the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. When the daughter of Herodias came and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. The king said to the girl, ask for me anything you want and I'll give it to you. And he promised her with an oath, whatever you ask I will give to you, up to half my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask for? The head of John the Baptist, she answered. At once the girl hurried into the king with the request, I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was greatly distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he did not want to refuse her. So he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The men went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. On hearing of this, John's disciples came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. Mark's story began with introducing us to John the Baptist. John, we learned there, was a preacher with a God-given ability to speak about the future. He was remarkably successful in his preaching, and he baptized Jesus, at the same time pointing out that Jesus was the great deliverer of humankind, the person that God had promised for so many centuries. Some of John's teaching, however, had proved too much for the political leadership of Jesus' time, as we've just read, and he'd been imprisoned in the king's stronghold of Machaerus. Tragically, it was there that his life was ended. However, it's probably appropriate to ask the question as to why Mark includes this story at this point in his book, since he does not always recount incidents in chronological order. In the previous stories, Mark seems to have been particularly interested in the different ways that people responded to Jesus. I would like to suggest that this interest continues here, and he retells this incident, John's martyrdom, to point out once again the different ways in which people responded to Jesus. And of course, in doing this, he's challenging each one of us today to ask ourselves which of these examples best applies to us. One response to Jesus can be described as total disinterest. Salome's part in the story here is quite remarkable. While there are those who are ready to defend her, the brief account given of her conduct here and in the Gospel of Mark suggests that she is tactfully described as conducting herself improperly. It's not usual that princesses are part of the entertainment at royal feasts, but without apparently being invited, she takes centre stage. Again, it's not stated plainly that her dance was erotic, but any knowledge of ancient and even contemporary feasts would suggest that this is exactly what form of dance she adopted, and in the presence of men who were probably drunk and lecherous. Simply, she's presented to us tactfully, but as a shameless young woman. And this hardened shamelessness is demonstrated in what followed next. When she was offered a reward for her dancing, she consulted her mother. Unsurprisingly, Herodias seized the opportunity to get rid of her nemesis, John. However, Salome added a further request to that of her mother. Herodias appears to have simply asked for John to be beheaded. Salome, however, adds a macabre touch. She wants the head brought to her on a plate. She thus shows a delight in what most people would regard as unacceptably cruel conduct. She was certainly not interested in either John or concerned about his fate. There could scarcely be a more vivid picture of a hardened young woman, and the consequence was that she had no interest whatsoever in the teaching of the remarkable miracle worker to whom John had pointed. Now, few, if any, of us undertaking these studies are likely to be remotely like Salome, and yet it is possible for us too to dismiss any consideration of Jesus and his teaching. We too can be so self-centered that we give no consideration to anything that might challenge our values and our way of life. There is, I suggest, a little bit of Salome in all of us if we're not very careful. Herodias offers a slightly different illustration. She's implacably opposed to John and the one of whom he preached. Herodias had it in for John because she was offended by his labelling her conduct for what it was, sin. Unwilling to listen, she was less dispassionate than Salome. She hated both the message and the messenger and would do anything to rid herself of the nagging message that John was proclaiming. Herodias then is an example of those people who don't want to hear the good news and don't want to be reminded of what it says. It's too demanding, requiring repentance and a radically changed lifestyle. People like Herodias are often the most vocal in their opposition to Jesus, appealing to all sorts of unlikely reasons as to why he's to be ignored, but for them the issue is not really intellectual, whether it's true or not, but moral. It is simply too demanding and requires personal repentance. There is, however, another response, intellectual interest. News of Jesus had reached the palace of Machaerus on the northeast shore of the Dead Sea, many miles from Galilee, where Jesus was undertaking his ministry at this time. And this was accompanied by considerable and animated discussion. Jesus was an interesting issue to debate. And Jesus remains of interest to the publicist and can, appropriately packaged, be guaranteed to generate lively debate today. But for many now, as then, it goes no further. There's no sense that this is an issue that is too urgent to file in the interesting and unresolved category of questions. Might this be true of you or me? Two other responses are described in this story. The first is what I call conviction without conversion. Herod is perhaps the classic example of such a person in the Bible. Herod knew the convicting power of both the messenger and his message. He was a man who had recognized in John someone with a supernatural quality of life. He was holy and righteous. And he had listened to John and had experienced that mixture of conviction and consolation that Jesus' message brings. For Herod, there was no question as to what was true. However, in the end, he consented to John's death. Several reasons are offered by Mark for Herod's actions. There was his fear of Herodias, and his intellectual and moral weakness, which could see no way out of the oath and didn't want to lose face in the front of his subjects. Times change, but human nature doesn't. Many on the fringes of Christianity seem like this today. They know the truth, but, for example, family or peer pressure, inability to get a clear head on the issues, fear of losing face, unwillingness to change a lifestyle, mean that welcoming Jesus and his message does not follow. As this passage indicates, this is a miserable existence. For conscience is often tender and pricks uncomfortably and often, but with no lasting response. Finally, Mark refers to total commitment even to death. John the Baptist is a wonderful example of the person willing to face the challenge to faith, to enjoy its privileges, but endure its costs, and to be wholehearted and unwavering in commitment. And no less is required of us if we are to be genuine Christians.